Hey guys, it is Tim here with Tabletop Terrors, and I am joined today with Chris of the YouTube channel Drop Dice, and we're going to talk to you about running your very first session of Dungeons and Dragons. It's probably not what you're thinking. Today we're going to talk about something known as a session zero. Now, the reason, apart from I love talking to Chris, the reason he is particularly in this stream is because Chris is the one who taught me how to do a session zero. And when we were trying to get a campaign started, he suggested one. And over the course of the last year, I think we've been meaning to really, hey, we should do a video on that. And today is that video. So Chris, I'm going to throw it to you just in general. We're going to go through a lot of cool stuff you prepared, but why a session zero? Why are these even important?
So a session zero in its most basic terms is basically getting together and making sure that everybody's on the same page. And why it's important is pretty much like, think of it like if you were in a business and you were to start a project. That project's not going to go anywhere unless you have a project planning meeting. This is essentially the project planning meeting of your campaign. It's to get everybody on board, get the idea of what roles are, who's doing what inside this project, because together you're writing a story, which is its own project. So it makes sense to go from it from kind of an organized point of view instead of just kind of going immediately into it. I've found that when I do session zeros, I'm either much more happy with how it goes, or it goes longer than I was expecting if I had just gone in blind. For example, the first couple of years that I played D&D, we played 4 or 5 campaigns per year that really weren't very much of campaigns. They were like, oh, I've got this cool idea, and we played until that cool idea was done, and then we changed the system or the game or just something entirely dramatic changed. Like the whole world would not be the same one that we were playing a week ago because we didn't think beyond here's a 2-sentence idea. And that's kind of where the session zero goes, unless you develop a long-term campaign so that you can do something like, for example, the Provokers.
Yeah, and that's perfect because if I had to distill it down to what we're really trying to do it's just manage expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Even things as simple as, well, I want it to be action-packed. Defining what everyone has an idea of regarding what they consider action-packed.
Mm-hmm.
Just defining terms, developing creative language. When you say one thing, what do you really mean? And making sure that everyone is just starting with their expectations managed so that you don't get midway through the first game or 2 games in and think, I hate this, or I don't want this, or I was expecting something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing that I will say about a session zero is I put together a checklist that's going to be on the Tabletop Terrors website. But that checklist is not 100%. It can be modified any way that you want. And of course, you don't have to answer all of those questions up front. The ones that I put in the checklist are pretty front end loaded type questions to kind of get those done. But let's say you're halfway through your campaign and all of a sudden a player changes what day they're available for. You can totally do just like a miniature session zero. Essentially pick out the questions that matter and be like, hey guys, so Wednesday night doesn't work. What night works for everybody else? Do we still want to do it 6 to 10? Do we still want to do it at Randy's house, or whatever the case may be? So don't think of it as a one and done thing. This is something that you may have to revisit throughout the whole campaign, and that's totally fine to do so.
I love it. And so what we'll do is, Chris has prepared a document, and this document, like he said, we're going to put it on Tabletop Terrors website. But for now, are we going to just go ahead and put it in the video description? Is that cool? The Google Doc, or
yeah,
great. Yeah, we want to.
That way, if people want to open it in another tab and kind of see what we're talking about, they can.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. So I'll go ahead and I will put. Is this link?
It is a comment link, so they can comment on it and review.
Perfect. So I'm all right. Excellent. I'll drop it into the chat so everyone can follow along. And then when the video is done, when the stream is over, I'll go into the description, and that'll be right underneath the video description will be the link there.
And then you can swap it out once we get the Tabletop Terrors one, of course.
Perfect. Beautiful.
Perfect.
Awesome. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and work through this document. And feel free, this is a live stream, so obviously ask any questions in the chat if you'd like to. We may not be able to keep a perfect eye on it if it moves pretty rapidly. But yeah, so I'm looking at this document and it says the primer, right? So that's the name of this whole document. And you started off with something called the pitch. Tell me about the pitch. Why is the pitch important and what are you trying to do with this?
So the pitch is important because if you know anything about doing theater or putting on TV shows, or just in a basic understanding of how that works, is basically you come together with like a 2-4 sentence idea of, hey, this is what I envision. And you have to basically sell that idea to other people so that they can be excited about it. And that's why it's so important. The pitch that I've outlined inside there is a super basic pitch. Basically, it's to say, you know, I want to run a genre using a system and would like to explore the theme or setting. What do you guys think? So, for example, I want to run a horror mystery game using Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I want to explore the idea of self-sacrifice in the Dragon Grin setting. What do you guys think? That basically gives an idea. Now, the only thing that I would say about this example is this example does kind of expect that your players understand what Dragon Grin's setting is. However, you can use that as an opportunity, because if they ask you, then you can go, okay, well, Dragon Grin's kind of a low fantasy setting. It's a little gritty. Evil has taken over the world. Does that sound interesting to you? And you might have a player who turns around and says, you know, I did a really dark campaign last time. I don't know if I want to do that. What if we tried something a little bit more like basically the same idea, but I want the gods to be involved, that it's self-sacrificing for the gods. And we want to play like a high fantasy, high religion type game. And you can modify that pitch. And the biggest thing is when you do a session 0 is it's all about communication, and you have to be able to listen as well as tell, and be open to for the critiques from your players, because ultimately it's all of your story.
And a big question, I get this question once a month, and this ties directly into it, is, hey, Tim and James, they ask the, Tabletop Terrors channel, I've got this crazy idea for a game. And what I'm going to do is, and they have this really long kind of drawn out plot, and they go, and I'm going to spring it on them. And it's going to be this huge plot twist. And the issue I have with it a lot of times is that it's not following the pitch guidelines, meaning the player's expectations are being led in an entirely different direction for a long time before this cool bomb that the dungeon master drops, which sort of breaks the social contract. So what I wanted to point out that I've learned is, as a dungeon master, please remember the cool part is in playing out the story. Absolutely. Don't get so, don't get so strung up in the concept that you want to keep it close to your vest, so close to your vest that the players don't know what they're getting into, because it will get sticky.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I specifically tried to target inside the pitch idea is that you're talking about themes. You're not talking about what the adventure actually is. You're talking about what kind of mood and tone it takes, because the adventure is going to be shaped by you playing the game. So if you begin thinking about how, oh, I want to have this really cool thing happen, and you get real excited about this one scene, if your players never come to that scene, it may not be useful for that specific adventure. So instead, write down those things inside your Google Documents, your notebook, or whatever you use. And if it comes up and becomes an opportunity to explore that little featurette that you've developed, then do it. The one thing that is different about doing a pitch for a game, a role-playing game, versus like a TV show or a book, is you have multiple people writing in it. So you have to understand and leave things open. Whereas a TV show, you can kind of talk about where things are eventually going to go, because it's all scripted out. You know how things are going to go. And the fun of playing a role-playing game is ultimately being able to say, you know what, my character doesn't follow this narrow path that the game designer came up with. Instead, I choose to go back to that village and talk to the fisherman, which is totally anti whatever your story was, but that is now your story.
And I think that's cool, because this theme, this quick elevator pitch, is, if it's within the social contract, then the game master should be okay with it. Meaning, if it's about self-sacrifice in Dragon Grin, if it's something that's going to cost me something to go back to this fisherman, it fits the tone and the feel. So we kind of have this high-level social contract. The other thing is, I think, and this is just This is what I've seen. I've done this. I was this guy. So understand that I understand. You want your first D&D campaign to be this sweeping, incredible epic where they start out as lowly peasants and eventually they're fighting god kings. That can happen. That's awesome. But you have to distill that thought into this so that you can target how to actually achieve it. In other words, I like how specific yours was. It's like, hey, I want to run a horror mystery using Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, and I want to explore the idea of self-sacrifice in the Dragongrin setting. That kind of keeps things relatively tight. It's not, we want to, but if you wanted to have a sweeping, scoping epic, you say it here and now so that the players are in for that.
Absolutely. And a bit of advice that I have for new GMs especially, and seasoned GMs that have gotten themselves in kind of a rut, is don't plan an epic, plan a story arc. Simply because if you plan a story arc, once that story arc concludes, there's going to be things that are left over, loose strings that you can follow to create the next story arc, to create the next one. And when you put in those 3 story arcs, that's what a trilogy really is. Look at Star Wars. Each movie is independent of each other, but when you put them together, it's the story, well, the original 3, it's the story of Luke Skywalker coming to terms with who he is and his father, and eventually saving the universe. And that's kind of a good way to look at it, is to break it down into what is important right now. Matt Click in the Provokers does a very good job of that. Inside season 1, it's about the Corruptor. What is the Corruptor doing? And each city is actually its own story arc. There's the story arc that goes into who the elves are, who the dwarves are, who the humans are. And there's the overbearing arc of who the Corruptor is in his story. And then if you look at how he goes into the season 2, he uses that leftover string of who the Corruptor was to start the new story. So that's a great example.
Yeah, and that's really, really good advice, is focus on what's important right now. Mm-hmm. So, you're a new dungeon master, you're watching this video, and you're like, I thought you guys were going to tell me exactly what to do. Trust me, we are. This advice is going to save you hours of headache and possible infighting and heartache when there's tension or conflict that could have totally been avoided if everyone got on the same sheet of music, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely.
So go ahead.
The one thing that I did want to say about the part that's not necessarily detailed inside here is where you do your pitch. The pitch is a thing that you should produce to anybody who's interested in playing, whether that's an online group or if you want to do something face-to-face, your friends, your coworkers, or you can take this and write it down and say, hey, this is the kind of game that I'd like to play. I'd like to use this system. Is there anyone interested? If you print that off and you leave it at your game store on a poster board, because almost every game store has one of those by their door, or you drop it off at a local college on their pinup boards, wherever they happen to be. I know that University of Houston has like 6 of them on the campus, and I've been up there and I've seen D&D posts which pretty much follow this basic idea. I want to play a game of D&D once a week or every other week or something like that. And that's a good way to find your group in the first place. Doing the posting with people that you don't know can be a little intimidating, but I recommend that you at least give it a try, because you never know. You may find the person who just super jives with you from that point forward, and you may find your provoker group, because those were a group of guys that Matt got together just out of the group that happened to have YouTube channels. And that was the one prerequisite, if I remember right, was that you guys all had YouTube channels, and that's why Matt picked you.
Yeah, it was like, it was like, hey, these guys, and you know why? Because he had an opportunity to kind of see us talk and know, oh, okay, these guys could be, cool players. I think the other thing too is, if you're making that posting, just remember this. This is what people are going to judge you by. What would you think? How does the post look? Meaning, you pin it to the bulletin board. Just take a little care, spell things correctly. Yeah. You don't have to go nuts and go Photoshop and do all this crazy stuff, but make a flyer that you would stop, read, and then tear the little, email thing off the bottom and email. That's the other thing too. I wouldn't leave your phone number laying around personally.
Yeah, I would go with that. That's kind of more practical and a little bit more safe for you, just in general. The one thing that I typically do, especially for online posts, is I do like to include some inspirational art, so that, because there's there's the saying, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and I really believe that. So if I put in 2-3 pictures that kind of have a similar tone to what I'm looking for, that may be enough to spark someone's interest, because I'm the kind of person that if I don't have anything that immediately sparks me inside your interest post, I might move on and go to look at somebody else's. But if you have a picture inside there and maybe what you're saying doesn't quite convey it 100%, but that picture really strikes me, I'll be like, oh man, that Fae game looks really cool, and I'll jump right in.
And to speak to that, I mean, if most people have access to Google Docs, if they have the internet, or Microsoft Word even, you can drop pictures, images into those easily and just print a basic color printout for your, you know, for your post. If you're doing it, coffee shops that have bulletin boards, college campuses, those kinds of places. So yeah, so that's how to sort of get your feelers out there for a physical group, or you can join some of the online groups that we're a part of, like the Absolute Tabletop Facebook group.
Now, the one thing that I will say is, because I know that you've received this question a lot, my community is a little smaller, just because I don't know, I'm not really sure. I think my videos are pretty good, and I think it's just I have like a loyal core is what it is. But one of the things that I hear a lot is, you know, I live out in the middle of nowhere. Let me tell you where I live. I live in a place called Alvin, Texas. If you want to Google that, it's in the middle of nowhere. It seems relatively close to Galveston and Houston, which are two bigger cities, but actually it's farm country. I'm in like the only apartment complex in Alvin. There's two, but they're right next to each other. But to give you an idea, there's a YMCA in my town. I've seen D&D posts at the YMCA. There's a community center. I've seen them there as well. There's a college that's right nearby that you can go to that college and you can put stuff up. If you can find anything that is a gathering location, I mean, even if it was, let's say your area of the city has absolutely nothing around, but there's like a city park that does have a bulletin board, take advantage of the bulletin board. You'll find that there are people who are interested in at least trying if they don't have experience. Another great use is family. I know that Tim's about to start a family campaign, and you'd be surprised if you express your interest to your family if they at who will become interested in it. I know that my cousin and her husband have expressed interest in playing D&D because it's a thing that I really love and I'm passionate about. So sharing that passion will find you players.
Awesome. So there you go. So there's some tips on how to find some people, and then after you do find that group of people, this is the good way to find something that you all agree on, which is the pitch. Now, we're not going to go too deeply into this, but I might forget later, so I want to make sure to say this. There's no rule or contract socially that says you have to play with another person, meaning you might cordially meet, discuss, and find out that there's not really a lot of common ground. That's okay. And it's okay to say, okay, well, you know, it's probably not best that we play together. I have had that happen before, and it saved me and the person. It was actually after a session 0. And I just said, you know, I thought this was something different, and I'm not really into what we're doing. And that person said, oh, no problem. It solves a lot of problems later down the road if you're just really upfront. And it can be awkward, but trust me, that 10 seconds of awkwardness followed by maybe like 1 or 2 minutes of like, saves you weeks and months of stress.
Yeah, absolutely. Like a good example, Lloyd, the Jarl GM, excellent GM. He runs a very gritty game. Let's say that I, who happen to love gritty games, for some reason didn't like them. If during a session 0, Lloyd told me about that, I could say, hey, you know, this campaign sounds great, but it's just not going to be for me. And that's part of kind of the next section, is setting the expectations, and having that doorway out is entirely open to all the players and the GM for that matter. I know I've talked to a Roll20 group that wanted a GM, and what they were expecting from the GM was not quite in line with how I GM, and I just didn't feel like it was a good fit. So I, of course, had to back out then. So, I mean, just you as the GM are another player, and you have every opportunity that your players do to both have fun and to leave the experience if it is not fun for you. So the next section is kind of talking about what your expectations are for the game. And what it is inside here, you kind of talk about the world and some basics of it. So the one thing that I always like to start with is what are called touchstones. Touchstones are references for your players. For example, if I wanted to play Dragon Grin, there's a Dragon Grin campaign that I can refer my players to, and they can take a look, watch an episode or two, and they can get a basic idea of what's going on in the world. Or if you wanted to play Legend of the Five Rings in my personal version of what the setting is, I could refer you to my campaign world, and you can follow those. Or you could say, hey, for the horror mystery idea, Stranger Things, In the End, John Dies, and Psychopaths are all my inspiration for it. They could take those on and kind of look at it because of those specific things that I mentioned. What I'm looking for is basically a slow burn mystery with a lot of action in it, because all three of those things that I touched on have that kind of thing going on. In the End, John Must Die is super action packed, and there's a lot of weird questions that present themselves throughout the whole thing. Stranger Things, only the kids really kind of know what's going on, but they don't really know what's going on until much later inside the series. And then once they do figure it out, it's a question of, okay, well, how do we deal with this thing that we still can't really explain? And then, like, for example, the Psychopaths one. Psychopaths is kind of the same idea, that you figure out what the problem is, but it's a question of, can you stop it? There's a lot at stake if you don't succeed in it. And using those touchstones will really set parameters of what you expect for the game. This is also a good idea to ask the players, hey, is there anything like these things that maybe you want to bring into the game? So for example, let's say that I present the horror ideas to you, Tim. Is there any touchstones that you'd like to add to my little list here as far as like maybe a mystery horror idea?
Sure. So in true Session Zero fashion, I know nothing more than what you've put here. Mm-hmm. So I would probably say something like, yeah, I'm a really big fan of Lovecraft. And so if it doesn't have to be Eldritch, but I would love some sort of Lovecraftian elements. And, kind of that vein. I wouldn't mind if it was cosmic horror versus a slasher or another more terrestrial creature or monster, So that would be what I would throw at you. I'd say, hey, I'm a big Lovecraft fan. I would love that sort of suspense and tone if you'd be down with that.
And that's perfect. That's the kind of response that you want to elicit from your players, and you want to take notes. Throughout the whole document, I tell you to write things down over and over, because that's really your job during a Session Zero as a GM, is to write this stuff down, because it's going to be the stuff that makes your campaign what it is eventually. So by the way, if you haven't seen In the End, John Dies, you should. It's a good Lovecraft movie. Well, it's technically not Lovecraft, but it's definitely inspired.
I have seen it. I actually have seen it.
It's hilarious and good at the same time. But so with that information, I write down, okay, Lovecraftian horror on my little notepad here. And your notepad doesn't need to be organized. You can go back and fix it later. I usually like to kind of free form write everything down as it comes. That way I don't forget things instead of focusing on a format. From there, we go on and we kind of discuss things like what we want the game to be. When we want the game to be. So a suggestion that Tabletop Terrors gave in the Absolute Tabletop group was pick a day of the week and say, hey, our campaign's going to live on Wednesday nights. I do that as well. Like my L5R game is on Twitch right now, and it lives on Tuesday nights. It doesn't necessarily mean that every Tuesday I'm going to play, but it means that when we play, it's going to be a Tuesday, and we'll find what works in our schedule. I find that works really well for online groups. In-person games, I think it's because you go to them or people come to you that it's a little easier to actually make it happen every week. But if you do successfully do it every week online, hey, that's awesome. I find that scheduling online can be like the hardest thing to do, as weird as that sounds.
No, I agree with that. And I think that it is the polar opposite. Well, it's like the ability to jump through and have this. I mean, you're in Texas and we're having this hangout. There's also, especially if you don't know the people very well, there's a distance in communications. People can go off the grid. And I'm not suggesting that everyone does that, but it's easier to ignore a message or not reply right away or blow it off and things like that. Whereas in person, it's like, hey, I'm going to see you anyway. Like I know you're around. Yeah. I just saw you at Target,
Now I do have to be. I am corrected here. It is. It should actually be John dies at the end. I've got the name mixed up there.
Oh, gotcha. And I wanted to ask a quick question. So I think just for advice for new game masters, these new dungeon masters who are doing this, these touchstones, these sort of big ideas for tone and concept, do you think like 3 is a good starting number to kind of have in your head as a dungeon master, or what do you think a good number is?
So my usual reference point of like what I suggest to people is 2 to 5. If you get past 5, it starts to sound like a weird laundry list, and you may be covering a little bit too much. Because if I tell you those 3 that I listed, and then I add the Vlad Toltos novels to it, and I add like one specific book from Dragongrin, what I've done is I may have expanded what your idea of the campaign is further than what my idea of what the campaign is. So what you want to do is pick out 2 to 5 really on target choices, things that most generally focus in on what you're looking for.
I would even suggest, as we're talking through this, similar to the pattern you have in the genre and style and system of the game, as you're picking these touchstones, don't just say Lord of the Rings. That's a little too broad, in my opinion. I think instead say the epic journey feel from Lord of the Rings.
Absolutely.
Some kind of a descriptor that ties it in with that bigger thing will really help everyone get on the same page. Because if I said Lord of the Rings, I mean, there's a lot in there. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Like any sort of saga that you choose to reference, I would pick out an aspect of that saga. Like when I gave the example of including a Dragonlance book, I didn't say Dragonlance. I said one specific book from Dragonlance. That's because there's last count was like 94 books in Dragonlance. Like if I just said the series, it would be overwhelming. You would you wouldn't have any idea where to even begin. Even if we played a game in Dragonlance, you would still need to narrow it down to like a couple books to give the idea.
So once you find the night for your campaign to live on, so we're going to do Tuesdays, so it's going to be once a month. That's my minimum commitment that I want from my players. Okay. It could be twice, but to me, I want everybody to have their breathing space. I want this game to be fun. I don't want it to feel like something that's an imposition on their schedule. So let's say Tuesday nights, at least once a month. Probably 2 Tuesdays a month would be ideal, but 1 a month is the bare minimum. So we found the day that our campaign's going to live on. We've talked about the pitch. We all kind of agreed we're going to do horror. And then some of your touchstones included, you listed some cool movies, and then I threw in some Lovecraft stuff. What comes next?
The next thing is, for a lot of people, they don't include it in their session 0 because they may have been friends for a long time and these things have been established. What I would recommend this next part is more for people that you may not be familiar with. Talk about etiquette for the game table. These are people that are taking 4, 6, 12 hours or however long out of their day, once a month, once a week, etc., to be at your house, someone else's house, and talk about the expectations that come with it. This is just common courtesy stuff. Like, if a player is going to be absent, how do you want to handle that? At my table, because I really don't like absences, I find them disturbing to the storyline. I have a policy of, if you call me ahead of time or let me know ahead of time, it's totally fine. But if you do a no-call, no-show, after 3 of them, you're dead. And that's it. You can come back with a new character, but I can't make a character who disappears randomly make sense in the story. So if it continues to be a pattern after that, of course, I'm going to ask you to leave the table because it's just obviously our schedules aren't working. And it's the other thing that I do, I don't want to make it sound too harsh, is I do revisit scheduling before I even get to the point that it's like, okay, your character's dead. But the idea basically is that, who's going to have food there? Whose house is it going to be at? What are the expectations of how the house should be when you leave? I know that growing up in California, we went over to my friend Donovan's house and we were allowed to be in other rooms, but his mom's request is that all the gaming happened in one room, all the food stayed in one room, and that we cleaned up before we left. And that was just our rules. And after the first couple games, we got the hang of it, and it never had to be brought up again, which is why I said the etiquette question is really more for when you have newer people. For online, some of the things that you might want to consider is eating acceptable during your game? Are cameras required? Do you want people to be on a computer, or is a mobile device acceptable? Personally, I don't like mobile devices because the connection typically isn't that great. And echo is a real thing on mobile devices, like really, really bad. So I try to have players that can at least commit to it. And because I run a channel, if my game's recorded, I prefer you to have a camera. However, it may not be necessary. If I like your playing style, but you don't own a camera, I can make exceptions. That's like a soft thing. And that might be something you want to include inside your interest posts, especially for online. I know I have the bad habit because of my timeline of eating in every game. Like, you will never see a game that does not include me eating. That's because everybody plays at 7 o'clock on the East Coast. Well, that's 6 o'clock Central Time. That's when I'm supposed to be eating my dinner. I just got home from work. I'm trying to cram pizza in my mouth and tell you what my character's doing. If that's not acceptable to you, I need to know so that I can turn off my camera and not make a scene.
I think something else too, for me, I think this social contract is even potentially more important when you know people very well.
Yeah.
Because you're so comfortable around each other. And nobody wants a dungeon master who treats them like they're the boss. Don't get me wrong. But just having those, like you said, when you're close friends with somebody, it's a little easier to me, I think, to just be like, hey, I'll see you later. And then there's a mess left. Or just small things, or like even how, and we could do a whole stream on this another time, but the idea is just manage expectations of, hey, if it's not your turn, I don't mind if you have quiet side conversation, or if it's not your turn, please pay attention because I want to really keep the game immersed, and all those kinds of things. I think that social contract in the session 0 is really, really important because, again, those small things start to poke little pinholes in your campaign.
Yeah.
The story is great. The characters are great. Everything's great. But Marsha's on her phone all the time. And it's annoying you, and it's annoying one other player. 2 other players don't care. Well, now it's much more difficult to address because you never said anything in the beginning. But if you mention it up front, hey, I'd rather if we didn't do phones, or hey, we'll do phone breaks after each round, round of combat, or however your group wants to do it. But make sure that those things are clear so that there's not tension that's caused outside of game and messes up the campaign.
Okay, it looks like we do have a question from Nicholas Jacket. By the way, the chat is giving a lot of really good like additive points along the way, talking about like they brought up food just as I was also bringing up food at the table and how you want to handle that. Our chat is doing very well. So if you are in there, thank you very much for your input. We appreciate that. But from Nicholas, it says, do you think you need to remind people they have to be focused during the game? I feel people get a bit lost when they're online and they just drift from the game. So it's so weird. I think it's person to person is really the best way I can say this. I set my expectations as a GM of what I expect from you as a player. And I say, hey guys, we're online. We have family and stuff going on in the background. If you have to go because there's something going on, like let's say Tim's child is getting sick in the background, just go ahead and pop that inside the side chat, turn off your camera, and I'll make a quick note of it for the audience. Be like, hey, Tim had to go. His daughter is getting a little sick right now. And then you can come back when you want. But for a person who is drifting, and let's say that, because I know personally myself, I have 2 monitors. Usually I put the game that I'm playing and then the game's chat on the second screen. And that's how I operate. But as a player, I don't necessarily have to monitor the chat. My second monitor, if I was inclined to do so, I could do something like open a video game. And unless you have me as a Steam friend, you might not know that I'm playing some game in my Steam account right now when it's not my turn and not paying attention. That player I usually address after the fact. That's also a reason that in my in-person games, I have a rule of no computers at the table, with the exception of like a tablet for a character sheet. It took me a long time to accept even a tablet, just because I find electronics to be very invasive to the gameplay. And it took me a little while to find people that I feel like do put the game first when they're on the computer. So I certainly understand the concern. A lot of people, adult conversation is all you really need with them. Don't be too pressing about it and be like, hey, look, I understand it's distracting. We're on a computer. It's easy to open up another game in a window or do something else. But if you could, I would like you to pay a little bit more attention. That way, when the players interact with you, it's a little bit more natural to the story, that sort of thing.
And that's a great way to address it. You know, one of the things I use is humor. And now I'm not saying make light of it or be sarcastic. And I'm not even suggesting you do this if this isn't something that comes naturally to you and you can speak to it in your own personal way. But like for me, after the game, I'd probably be like, hey, buddy, what was going on there? It was a little, were we keeping you busy during your video game? Like, you know, I'd kind of,
yeah.
And that would be my first line of defense. Now, some people, I think, aren't capable of doing that. It would come across wrong. For me, I'm going to make a joke about it first. Then if it happens again, I'm going to do exactly what you said, Chris, which is wait until it's over. The game's done. I personally would probably even wait until the following day because I want them to have a good experience. I want everybody to be thinking good, positive things about the game. The next day, I'd probably go, hey, man, just want to hit you up. You seemed a little distracted last night. Just wanted to make sure everything was cool. I probably wouldn't even accuse them of a video game, even if I saw their Steam stuff up, you know. Just want to make sure things were cool, you know, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah, sorry, man. You know, et cetera, et cetera. So usually that's all it takes is just a light addressing of it. If it continues, like Chris said, then it's kind of like, hey, man, I get that this is probably not your thing. Maybe, and you can come up with alternatives. Maybe they play every other week. Like Chris said, you plan for their character to be in and out. But these are all things that you need to go over in that session 0.
The other thing that might be causing it too is this is a good opportunity for you to readdress the session 0 questions. Be like, hey, what's caused you to kind of linger? I know that in the first 6 sessions you were super on board, but I've noticed in the last 2 you've kind of lingered away. You may not be paying attention. Think about what you did in those first 6 sessions. What kept his attention and the group's attention, or her attention in that case. And perhaps maybe you've gone away from doing at least 1 combat a session, and instead you've gone to really heavy role play sessions for the last 3. And maybe that's why that person's checking out, because maybe he enjoys the role play but likes the combat aspect, and because there hasn't been combat in 3 sessions, he's starting to linger because of that. So approach it with a light touch is kind of the best way to put it. Now, the other thing that I will say is, like my friend Murdoch, who plays my L5R game. Murdoch is a fidgeter by nature. He cannot focus on one thing without having something else going on. Inside L5R, typically he'll open up something like Ark or a survival game where all he's doing is mining while he's playing. And he can manage those 2, and it doesn't bother me because he stays focused on the story because he's doing a mindless task on the other screen. That doesn't bother me at all. What bothers me is when it's distraction and it comes to your turn, you're like, huh, what happened? Can you repeat everything that happened over 6 hours ago?
Dude, right? And you're like, over 6. No, I know what you mean, where you throw it to somebody and you go, all right, so, you know, Chris, how do you feel about that as the dagger slips into your back? And you go, no, wait, let me do it. Ready? Chris? Oh,
yeah.
Oh, you know, it's like I could see where your other monitor is because it's where you're looking, and I see the blue glow on your face. You know, I see the animations. So yeah, and this kind of brings this up.
I'm super guilty of that for like the first episode on Twitch because I was still learning the format. I'm like trying to figure out what's going on, and I'm like,
so you're like looking.
Yeah, so you guys go over there and do some stuff.
You're like, Chris, hello, Chris. I just want to say this too with the session 0, and this kind of goes through the entire campaign, which is you have to be okay with what the group considers fun outside of the game. This is mostly in-person games. Mm-hmm. It's hard to get a group of adults who have kids or lives or, you know, whatever. Everyone's got school or something, work, to get them together for 4 hours. So you have to be okay, in my opinion. You have to set the standard for what's socially allowed as far as catching up, making jokes. If you have that person with the iPad in their hand and they get the notification that the new Rogue One trailer just hit, premieres the internet, you have to be okay and understand that if your social contract allows, like, oh my God, new Rogue One, that everyone's going to gather around that and watch it. And that's not a slight to your game. It's we're all friends hanging out, and yeah, we're playing a game. So just make sure that you make that very clear up front. If it's like, no, you can use your tablet, but it has to be on airplane mode or whatever, don't feel like they're slighting your game or that they're not liking the game just because something else cool or funny or interesting happens. And my suggestion would be roll with it and kind of be a part of the joke and be a part of the fun. And don't be the dungeon master who sits there like this. Are you done? Yeah. If that's not the social attitude of the group, just make sure you figure that out up front. Because again, it can cause people being butthurt and, mad at each other.
There's another point coming up inside the chat is to use a teaching technique, which is find the person that is distracted and ask them the question to get them back into the story. That would be something that I would try as like my first line of defense. Like I have a player we're in a game store, there's stuff going on, there's a card tournament over here, and we're playing Dungeons and Dragons in our little corner, and he's like lingering because it's the 5th round and his buddy is up for the like store competitive championships or whatever. Be like, hey Tim, so the burglar broke in, what do you do? And if you hadn't been paying attention, you'd be like, okay, I'm sorry, I was a little distracted. Look, what's going on here? Like if you acknowledge it and you apologize and you're like, oh, okay, sorry, my bad. I'm more okay with that as a GM. And that's something that comes with my social contract. Other GMs may handle it a little differently.
No, I'm with that. I'm with that 100%. And I'll even take it a step further and say, as a player, this is not a free pass. But I would also appreciate, have that social contract where it's like, you know what? Hey man, I'm sorry. My buddy is in the final round of this huge tournament. Can we take 5? I just want to see the end of this game. Like, you have to be upfront and decide whether that's the kind of game master you are. For me personally, I'd go, yeah, as long as we can all herd the cats back here in like 10 minutes, if everyone else is cool with a quick break, you can go watch your buddy. Because I know that person, all they're going to be doing is thinking about that anyway. So me forcing them here at the table and missing that. So you got to decide. But for me, if as a player, be the kind of DM that the player can be that upfront with, and you'll say, okay, that makes sense. Like, yeah, okay, we can take 5, or we can take a quick break, or, oh, you need to call your wife, or, those kinds of things will come up. And again, it is not a slight to your game or your dungeon mastering or your storytelling. But as a player, also be sensitive to momentum and important moments and what's happening, that the game master has worked to build this, singleness of effect, that you don't shatter it because your buddy's in a card tournament.
Absolutely. Diego Gattens inside the chat just says, in my opinion, the best way to deal with distractions or such is adding rules to either penalize or help depending on the context. And that's basically what we're getting at. I try to avoid the penalization, at least in a very concrete way. When I used to play in the game store, if it was a combat and you weren't paying attention, you missed your turn. And that made the most sense because we didn't want to spend hours and hours and hours on what was already long because it was Pathfinder combat. So we have a group of 12 people that are level 8 or above. If you're not ready as your turn comes up, and I mean actually telling me what you're doing, not flipping through your spell book, your turn gets skipped because it was the only way to make the story cohesive and make a lot of sense. That I'm okay with. Penalizing your character, like you're not paying attention, so your character walks into a pit trap and takes like 26 points of damage. That I'm a little on the fence about. I think minor things, or maybe your character misses a turn. And the reason I like misses a turn is actually the other people at the table get mad at that player for doing it, so you don't actually have to police it. The other players are like, hey, pay attention. We need your damage. This boss won't go down if we're not all doing it.
Exactly. Yeah, so I think that's actually a really good point is, make sure that you understand you're not, I don't know how to say it the right way, you're not the boss of them, but you are the one who's taking your time to run this game. So it is a delicate balance, and if you punish them too harshly, trust me, the response won't be a good one.
Yeah.
If you kill them, it's going to escalate. They're going to be like, what? F this. Like, you don't want that.
Yeah. And like at the game store, the reason that we were a little soft on this, we chose to do this turn skipping because the rest of the players would interact with that person who's distracted and try and help figure out a way to keep them in the game. But where we ran into a head, it was at one point, one player just wasn't paying attention enough and they didn't move their character on the map at all. Their turn got skipped like 3 times and a dragon breathed on them twice and they were just done. So it was it was the thing that upset not even the person that died. The person that died was okay with it. She was like, whatever, I'll make a new character. It's my fault. I should have been paying attention. I'm sorry, I was really distracted today. And I even talked to that player and I said, hey, if you want, we can make a little storyline where your character gets resurrected and they go off to go find like the MacGuffin to bring your character back to life. It didn't actually anger that character. It angered another person at the table that I would go so far as to kill that player because they weren't paying attention. And that player I brought into the conversation of, hey, here's an idea. We can do a quest to resurrect your character. I promise it'll be like a one adventure type thing because you're never really like this. I don't really see a need to punish you to death. It's just the dice fell in that way, and I'm sorry for it. Definitely just be mindful of how you penalize. That's all I say about it. I'm on board with it. Just err on the side of caution is all I say. So Jeremy Lilly said, Tim and Chris, would you guys talk about or touch on drinking, smoke breaks, or perhaps other forms of inebriation? So in some states, it is legal to use other forms besides drinking and regular tobacco smoke. If you happen to live inside those states and you're participating legally, that's your choice as the people at the table, how you want to handle that. I live in a state where that is not legal. However, it's something that comes with our hobby. There are people who smoke pot, and that's just a thing. And I personally don't have a problem with it. I don't even care if it's at the table, so long as I'm not around it because I get drug tested at work. And so long as they're not just completely gone. If they're completely gone, my typical response is, hey, I had a lot of fun with you tonight, but you're becoming a bit of a distraction. You're making other people feel uncomfortable. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up tonight. Or maybe just ask that one person to leave. I personally like to wrap it up that night because maybe he's just not feeling it, and that's why he's turned into drinking, smoking, or whatever the case may be. And maybe instead of playing a game tonight, we just need to hang out and be friends. And maybe that's all that they're trying to get at. Maybe they had a rough day at work and they just need to chill.
Sure. And that's totally fine. And here's the thing. My social contract with my players is as long as you come to the game able to play at the level at which we've all set the tone and the bar at, honestly, you're an adult. Make those choices yourself. I personally, if anything, I'm a caffeine guy. I don't need, the last thing I need is a drink to kind of make me more sluggish or make my mind slower. But some people need that for nerves and things. So I guess to me, the social contract would be keep your crap together, like to a level that I feel is cool. And if that doesn't happen, I'll ask you to dial it back. And if that continues to not happen, I'll be like, yo, man, let's not. But I think that your method is very cool, which is, hey, it's okay to say to somebody, hey, you're tanked, man. Like, let's just chill. We'll just pause right here and let's let real life be real life. But for me, people are adults. That would be my social contract, which is,
yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to stop you from doing whatever you do. That's your thing. You
right.
With whatever consequences that come from that, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. What's my thing is I care about the game a lot. I put time into running it, and I just want to make sure that the story is enjoyable and is played at the level that we want to play it at.
Exactly.
So that's how I would treat it.
Yeah, and I would say that for me too, if you're cool with it, if that person's like, no, man, I was fine, but the other players and myself are like, no, you weren't, then that's where I'd say, hey, man, you weren't. Like, you need to back it off. No, I'm not trying to be your parent, but like you said, I spent a lot of time, effort, energy putting this game together, and I feel like it was met with nonchalance and honestly kind of a lack of respect because you're drunk, man. Or
Yeah.
you were so blazed that you were doing stupid stuff. I
was going to say, one of the things that I will say, I haven't encountered it yet, so I'm very appreciative of that. But I know that there are some people that like to vape, and vaping is an alternative to smoking that's a lot healthier for you. I can agree to that. But for someone who has asthma, the vapor is still a bothersome thing. So if somebody at the table goes, hey, man, your vaping's a little much for me. Can you save that for breaks? If you're the guy vaping, please be respectful. That's all there is to it. Like, my wife has asthma, so I have to ask people occasionally, hey, can you not do that in the house, kind of thing. Just be mindful, because in the end, you're here to be a bunch of friends playing a game and enjoy your time. You don't want to aggravate everybody else at the table. Is all I'm getting at with that.
Yeah, and if there are people who need to step out for a smoke break, because I understand too that some people can't wait 2 hours or whatever. Be cool with like, all right, hey, yeah, no, if you want to run out and grab a smoke, that's no problem.
And the part where you're setting expectations, that might be a good thing to ask. Like, I know that Power Up Gamers just said, although I do usually smoke at the table, he doesn't unless it bothers another player. If you were at my house, you can't smoke in the house. But if you want to take a break every hour just to take a quick 2-minute cigarette, I'm fine with that. I used to smoke. I know how it is. Totally okay with that. And that should be something that's brought up. Like if you have these vices or things that you like to indulge, then you should bring that up during the expectation section and say, hey, man, I smoke. So what are we going to do about breaks? Just so I can plan accordingly. Totally. And just have an open conversation about it.
Yeah, that's good. And then just to kind of talk about smokes, we talked about food as well a little bit, but I want to say this, and this is my big rule, which is you arriving at the house about 5 minutes, 10 minutes before the game, and then ordering food or wanting to deliver, get something delivered or run out and grab food is not okay. Mm-hmm. Decide how you're going to eat, decide when you're going to eat, or you will find yourself with someone showing up at 7 o'clock going, hey, I'm just going to run and get Chinese. It's only going to take a minute. They're back 40 minutes after start time.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, well, I'm doing pizza. Well, I want to do this. Well, I'm going to do this one. I'm going to run here. And it's like,
and that's why discussing the expectations of food is important. The other thing that you can do is, let's say that I know that for the guys that play my L5R game, when we played face-to-face, not only did we play the game once a week, we had family dinner once a week. And it was a question of, hey, let's do pot roast tonight. We need 5 pounds of pot roast, put it in the slow cooker. It's going to take 8 hours to do. And we'd figure out whoever's house it was. We'd buy all the supplies as a group and we'd put it together and we'd do like a nice family dinner. We'd start dinner at 6. We'd eat from 6 to 7, catch up about the week and stuff like that. And then at 7 o'clock, we'd usually start the game and play till about midnight, whenever the story naturally wraps up. And that may be something that you want to consider, because I found that works really well with that group because we're all close friends outside of the game. And so like those are all guys that showed up to my wedding from Boston. They came down to Texas. Like I wouldn't expect gaming with them to be any different. Like there's always going to be a social hour at the beginning so that we can catch up and talk, chit chat. Like even when we stream, the first like 15 minutes, the reason that the stream is almost always late is because we got talking about something that I was like, I don't know that I want to air this to everybody who's going to watch this game.
And that's a really good point, which is don't plan on the game starting when people arrive. I don't think. If we're hanging out, please don't just expect me to show up and be a player if we're doing the in-person game, because I want to do that. I want, hey, how's everything? How's your wife? Oh, that's great. And kind of talk through, pet your dog, sit down, and just like you said, catch up, eat some dinner. And I think that a lot of frustrated game masters happen where it's like, we're starting at 7 o'clock, be at my house at 7. And then you're just sitting there waiting, and 2 people start up a conversation because they saw Rogue One. And you're just like, guys, I'd really like to start.
Yeah.
I promise you the tone is just not going to be fun the rest of the night.
The one thing that I will say, add to your social contract immediately, is discuss how you feel about spoilers. Because I am super anal about that. If I haven't seen a movie, do not spoil it for me if it's a movie I care about. Like Rogue One, I happen to have seen, but if I didn't see it, all my friends live in Boston. They go to the midnight premiere the night before. And if they slip up, I just like throw the table. I'm done with game night. I'm like, no, you ruined it. I waited all year for this movie. And that's one thing that is like big to me. So if you have anything that you're big and kind of anal about, discuss that. That's kind of the basics of what this etiquette portion's about. Oh shoot, did I miss the question? Yes, where'd it go? There was another question. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, from Nicholas. This is a tangent question, but I think it should be talked about since we're talking about how session zeros are not just session zero, that they extend over gameplay. He says, I appreciate you guys answering the question. I've got another question. If you see that players are not getting along, but they refuse to or sorry, if you see that players aren't getting along, but they refuse to talk to each other about it, should you force the issue to be resolved? It's hard to say. You got to think about the people that are involved. My personal way to do it is I'll wait a day after the game. Like usually if I have to address a single player about a single issue, that gets addressed that night because I don't like to sit on things like that. But if it's an issue between two players, I'm like, hey guys, do you want to meet up for lunch? And I'll tell the other two people that are not involved in this, hey, don't show up to lunch. And then I'll get those two and I'll just be at lunch with them. And it's like super shady the way I'm setting this up. And you guys can see the madness behind here. I go, oh, I guess the other two couldn't make it. And then while they're sitting kind of awkwardly be like, hey man, I noticed last night during the game, you guys were having a hard time. Is there something you guys want to air out? Do you guys feel comfortable with each other? Is there something I can change? And if you kind of say it as something I can change, like you're kind of taking on the blame, it'll open them up. They'll be like, no, it's not your fault. We're having an argument about if Jar Jar Binks was worth being included in as a character in episode 1 or something ridiculous like that. Because it'll always be something ridiculous. And you kind of talk it through and see if you can resolve it. If you cannot resolve it, find an alternative that works. I know that for me, there was a person that I used to play with that I could game with him. Totally fine with gaming with him because we're role-playing, we're playing different characters, but on a personal level, we are two entirely separate beings that just do not get along. So we didn't get along and we didn't hang out outside of the game, but we showed up, we were cordial to each other when we played, and we played the game. And that was what was important for our relationship as it was for that definition. Diego also suggests possibly a knife fight.
I'm down. Yeah, I'm down
okay
with that.
I
do the classic tie the wrist together kind of one, so that it's you got a classic an OSR feel to the knife fight. That's the other thing too, is that if
somebody mentioned I had a raccoon running around in the background, it's actually my cat. She's obsessed with me.
No, he does. He has a raccoon. One of the things that I was going to suggest was that where, I think, Chris, when you said, it's hard to say, some smaller tiffs will resolve themselves naturally. So the question you have to ask yourself is, are these two people fighting all the time on and off? Some great friends go through bouts where they're doing this for a month and then they're fine for 3 months and then they're doing this. So sometimes addressing it can open up the floodgates as well. So you have to decide how badly it's happening. Is it happening frequently, or was this just a one-time thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that was great advice, Chris, the taking them to lunch thing. And that's good.
For an online group, the thing that I would suggest would be a Facebook chat. Just because I know that we have an audience that does either both or one over the other. A small Facebook chat, you may want to consider doing it as a group with the people involved and as the GM as the mediator, or if it's between the GM and a player, I would suggest having a mediator, somebody that you both can be reliable and a level-headed person. Ideally someone in the group that you're normally pulling players from, just because it's a mutual friend at that point. It's harder when it's a player and a GM that are consistently having arguments. In that case, I would consider, is it something that can be resolved? And if not, go separate ways, because it's going to affect the way you run your game most likely. So
yeah, I agree.
Be cautious about that.
Yeah, and then it will ruin everyone else's experience. So, I think this is a good time, I think, to mention, which Chris mentioned previously, but I want to pull it in again and say, it is totally okay to revisit the session 0, and what did you call them, Chris? You called them state of the game?
State of the game is what I usually refer to it as. Like, I never really announce it as, okay, we're going to do a state of the game. But, I think of it in my head. Especially halfway through a story arc, I do want to go, hey, guys, everybody cool with the way the story's going right now? Is there anything that you want to explore further? Which will come up later inside our discussion of what Session 0 is. And basically, I retouch on a lot of the things that the Session 0 goes over, but I do it in a very passive voice. I don't do it as I did in Session 0 where I'm directing the conversation. It's more like, hey guys, is this still cool? All right, check. Is this still cool? All right, check. Is this cool? No. Okay, how should we change it? That sort of thing. When you get more experienced with a particular group and you run session zeros, your session zeros will function the same as those state of the game type sessions.
Sure. And you'll start developing creative language. Like the longer you work with someone on anything, even a D&D game, the longer you'll begin to have shared references, even inside jokes and things like that, where you can immediately get someone to a point you're trying to make by citing an old example of like, oh yeah, I don't want to do Princess in the Castle again. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a lot like Princess in the Castle. You know, like that sort of creative shorthand that you develop over time. But I think that being able to be upfront and honest at all times, the players should also be able to bring this up. So if you as a game master are fine, and 3 out of 4 players are fine, if you are that one player and you're sitting there and you're like, oh man, I really feel like this game it's a great game. It just goes consistently an hour longer than usual, and it's really messing things up. Everyone else is cool with it. It's okay to bring up to the game master and say, hey, I love the game, but we talked about it going from 9 to 12, and I'm more and more tired every time we play, man. We're up to 1:30, and that's not what we agreed on, and kind of dial it in from there. You're allowed to bring this up anytime, any of this stuff.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. For my L5R game, I'm trying to remember it because we haven't played so long, but Tom, one of my players, because of the time that he works, he has to end at midnight, which is 11 o'clock my time. And I feel super bad every time I go to like 10 minutes after. I'm like, Tom, I'm so sorry. Because he's got like an important job. He's a game designer. He manages servers. And if he shows up to work like half steam, that means that game is getting half steam today. So I always feel super bad because the game is out. People play it. He manages updates and things like that. And I'm like, not only am I letting Tom down and giving Tom a bad day, I might ruin his 2,000, 5,000 people audience that's playing tomorrow. Like, so Rob from Performance Check brought it up. He said, common decency and self-awareness should be present in all aspects of life, not just running a game. And that's basically all the social contract is just finding out what is considered common decency for your group. The setting expectations point is where I would talk about social contract type stuff. One thing that Diego said was possibly actually writing it down and having people sign it as a contract. It depends on your group. I don't necessarily find that necessary. I think I've been in groups that wanted to do that, and I object to it personally. I think that I'm a responsible adult, and if you try and make me sign a piece of paper about being a responsible adult, you're insulting me. And that's how I take it, because I'm very personal about that sort of thing.
It can be belittling. It also derides the concepts. It's like, what are you going to do? Like, what are you really going to do if I break this contract? Like,
yeah. And I mean, ultimately, if you do the written down, the ultimate clause of if you don't follow by the rules, you'll be asked to leave. And the question is like, how much of not following the rules is it, or whatever the case may be. I personally like to just treat it as an adult conversation. And if it needs to be revisited in the future or asking that person to leave, handle it as it goes. Another option that you have is, this is for characters having combative issues with each other, is PvP. I know a lot of people are not necessarily for it. Sometimes it makes sense in the story. So I wouldn't necessarily encourage it, but if it comes up, maybe you should roll with it as the GM. That's kind of the opinion on that one.
So I'm looking at the doc, and I see that the next section is called red light, green light. And what do you, like, we've done all this work. We've established a social contract. We've got our game night. Mm-hmm. I'm ready to go. Okay, let's start playing. But wait, no. What is red light, green light, and why is it very, very important?
So red light, green light is exactly what it sounds like. You're basically establishing behaviors that are absolute no's and absolute yeses. The reason I suggest doing it after setting expectations is because this is a really good point to be like, okay, so we've got our basic expectations down. Tim, is there anything that you are absolutely object to inside your games? Is there any topics that are considered off limits, things that you really don't want to delve into? Keep in mind, we're talking about a horror game, so what I'm thinking is probably going to be a little graphic. Let's start there. How about that? Tim, how graphic are you okay with me describing things? If it was a scale of like 1 to 10, what sounds good to you?
Sure. And for this, I'd say, I'm okay with the 10, but I don't find sadistic descriptions or overtly, I guess, focused in on the pleasurable side of pain or anything weird like that. Okay. Like, we should never find joy in it. In other words, like the reason why the game Doom gets away with being so gory is because it's like popcorn horror. And while I'm not suggesting we do popcorn horror, I don't really like sadistic violence if we can help showing it on screen. I don't mind a good fade to black, so torture and things like that. I just want to be careful that we don't focus on it too much and let it resonate a lot, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. If you have players that, or if you don't have a good starting point, my favorite starting point actually is, how do you feel about sex? Everybody has an opinion about that in their games. So if you just start there, that's an easy way to get them on this conversation. Because personally, for me, I don't need graphic details. I appreciate when in a game it's addressed and it's a thing that exists in the world, but I don't need to know, what your skill check was on
like
bed or whatever.
No specifics. That's what I would say about that. About sex or anything like that. No specifics. No need to role play or go into detail.
And going back to inebriation, there was somebody who, I think it was an Absolute Tabletop, it might have been in the one-shot group, brought up, how do you feel about drugs in game? Me personally, especially playing in fantasy worlds that are akin to like medieval Europe or ancient Rome or even Japan, inside L5R, I just introduced an NPC who is addicted to opium. That is a real thing inside my worlds. And so I feel that it should be there. I think if you were to kind of put on the rose-colored glasses and be like, there are no drugs anywhere, it just seems weird to me. So that would be something that you'd want to bring up. But I'm not going to, like, let's say I used drugs as a real thing in a modern game. I'm probably not going to bring up the super hard end. Like, I'm not going to go into people doing bath salts and running around naked on the freeway, kind of just the kind of stuff. But I'm going to talk about, they clearly have an addiction. There's pipes on the table. There's a box of open bath salts and razor blades on their coffee table, something like that, where it's insinuated, but it isn't necessarily the whole focus of the game. Because if you start to focus in on some of those inebriating effects, the game tends to take a different feel. And personally, it's not one I like.
Agreed. And I would say that to me, because this is a very, very subjective phrase, but keep it classy.
Yeah.
Do it like you'd see it in an Oscar-winning film, like with reality and gravity and truth, which it's often not going to be glorified or gamified or, so be honest. But yeah, I think yours is a really good way to put it, which is you can just as easily show those things rather than showing the guy doing bath salts and being weird. I think it's creepier to show those kind of things surrounding the area to kind of let that up. So I would totally let that in.
An example of like the bath salts. Say we're doing this horror adventure, and instead of Dragon Grin, we make it modern. There's the person that we're investigating, and he's got bath salts going on, and perhaps maybe that's just a red herring for the fact that he's possessed by an eldritch evil. And you can put stuff in like that to enhance your story. Don't just think of it as an aspect that's just kind of there. The one thing that I really don't like, personally for me, is it's a classic trope, especially in Chinese storytelling, is the drunken master. I like the drunken master if played well. The drunken master who is a complete lush, all over the place, does random nonsense in the game that really hurts the story, that bothers me. That player is having fun, but nobody around them has fun. Ultimately, when it comes to any of these topics, you need to be courteous of the fun that the others are having. And that's kind of the main thing with that, with any of those subjects. But with that said, addictions can be a fun thing to play out. Having a character who is a drunk, for example, on a planet that has no alcohol for whatever reason, and him trying to figure out if he can harvest alcohol from these weird cactuses out in the desert.
Sure.
Could be an interesting moment. But it shouldn't be every moment that the character has. Think of it as adding spices. You don't want to make it too spicy.
And that's the exact analogy I use. Literally, is that every one of these things, violence, sex, language. They're very spicy pepper. And it's not that some people don't enjoy that, but the more of those things you add in density, the more other flavors go away. You talked about how it changes the tone. Well, it's because those things are very powerful. They're overpowering in flavor if they're used too much. And so this is actually a good point to talk about at a table, your session 0, red light, green light. We're talking about the overall concepts and all this stuff. Well, I've got this idea. I'm going to play this addict you just mentioned. I'm an alcoholic. We're going to be stranded on a planet. Well, one of the other players is actually a recovering alcoholic. And so when they say, hey, my red light is I don't mind drinking in the game, but I don't like it to be the focus, or, that's weird for me. That is something to bring up, because that's going to change your character concept, or you guys have to agree on what's allowed and what isn't allowed. So this is why red light, green light is there. Like, yeah, especially, exactly. If someone has had a traumatic experience, or if.
And this doesn't have to be all negative. That's why there's also the green light aspect. Say that, Tim is super excited about exploring the idea of in-character love. He wants to actually do a love story because he's never done it before. It sounds like it'd be really interesting. This is a good time to mention that sort of thing. And I could write that down, and I could be like, okay, Tim doesn't want grotesque violence. He'd rather us fade to black, put that in parentheses. And then I put, okay, he's also interested in a love story. Now, he doesn't need to go into super details about, oh, I want her to be a barmaid, blah, blah, blah. Instead, he could just be like, hey, this is the theme I really want. And it's up to you as the GM to decide how that theme comes up. An interesting way that I would think about it is perhaps maybe Tim ends up interacting with a person that is a serial torturer. Like, she goes around and she tortures other people, and there's like this weird common thread that draws these two characters together. And eventually he finds himself in this position of being in love with essentially one of the evil people's minions, and give him a chance to basically turn her life around, or even possibly turn him towards their side, and let that explore through the game. Using some of those red light, green light behaviors can give you a very compelling story.
I like that a lot. So give me another couple examples of some green lights. So like, if I'm going to throw one at you and you tell me if this kind of fits. So if I say, it's important for me to start off as a kind of softer character who's very naive but positive, and I want to become more hard-edged, and by the end of the story, I kind of want to be embittered and totally change my view. Would that be considered a green light, or is that something that would happen earlier or later in the process?
So to me, that's considered a green light, but because of the way you're talking about it, the things that I picked up on is that you want to eventually become embittered, that you want to become jaded. And to become jaded, there has to be certain things that lead you to that point. So to me, hearing this from you, I think, okay, this is a long-term story goal, which is actually a really important part of developing a character, is deciding on your goals. The red light, green light also gives you some goals that players may not necessarily say directly. So that's part of the reason why it comes here before we do actual character goals and player goals. So in the idea of the horror game, my takeaway from that is I need to create at least 3 events where your character's core beliefs are tested, and make it to where there's a no-win scenario, pretty much. And they can't be back-to-back. They have to be kind of spread out, and they have to be something that dichotomically changes the way you view the world. So, for example, the Eldritch Horror idea, maybe the first time is you find an Eldritch Horror that's torturing someone, and you're able to defeat the horror, but that person is so far gone that maybe killing them is the best option. Like, putting them in an insane asylum because it's the 1930s is not a good plan. They're going to die in there anyways. You could just do it mercifully. That's a turning point for your character. A great turning point for a character you've previously played was Durgan inside Stone Rift. The conversation with his father. There was a shift in who Durgan was at that point. He was a naive man that was basically trying to become a paladin and understanding his powers, and he wanted to do what was right, but he didn't know how to do it. And then after talking to his father, there was this shift where it was like, I have to do what's right, not just I want to, that he felt a personal responsibility for it. And that's what led him to eventually, towards the end, be offered the kingship. And I think that that was probably a really good example of a character turn that's not necessarily a full 180.
That's great. Those are some great. Yeah, I like that. So the red light, green lights are really just setting up those must-haves and should never do's.
Alan Holloway brought up a good point. He said, funny enough, I've heard a lot of these issues and topics come up more in a World of Darkness game than a fantasy game like Dungeons & Dragons, because possibly that World of Darkness is a reflection of our own world. I think that these topics come a lot easier when it is a modern game, like especially if it's close to our own timeline. For example, I was in the military. I have PTSD issues. There are certain topics that if I feel comfortable enough, I'll tell the GM, hey, I don't want to see this because this is something that really bothers me on a personal level. And you have to, as a player and as a GM, come together and find those things that legitimately bother them. If they say, hey, I don't like a lot of grotesque violence, and they kind of pass it off like that, that's one thing. But if they tell you, hey, I don't ever want to walk into a scene where there are just dead bodies piled up like barricades to this fortress. I've done that in real life. I don't want to do it in game. You have to be able to listen to that. And just be respectful of it is all that comes out of that, the red light, green light stuff. The green lights are a lot of fun because it allows you to provide a chance to kind of turn the conversation so it doesn't feel super negative and bring everybody down as they're excited about the game.
Yeah, I like that.
Which is part of the reason why I bring it up and be like after everybody says like 2 or 3 things that they really don't want to see, be like, okay, let's change it up. How about things that you really want to see and get them back to the upswing of being excited about things? I like doing green lights after the red lights just to bring people back into the excitement.
That's a really good tip. So it's like, yeah, start with the red lights, then go to the green lights, which then, so we've done that. Okay.
The one thing that I will say though is this is a personal conversation with each player. Don't make it a group thing like you did previously for talking about expectations. Be like, hey, Tim, what do you not want to see in this game? What is unacceptable? Because if you make it a group conversation, they may be inclined to adjust their views to the group.
Sure.
And really, you're just trying to create an atmosphere that is welcoming to the players as people. It may not be welcoming to the player characters, which is a whole different thing, like Dragon Grin. The world is not welcoming to
right, exactly.
But it doesn't mean that when we go to a village that because a woman was violated, that I have to describe that because that's a trigger for somebody at the table that they don't want inside their game.
Exactly. And you know, I think practically, especially if people are playing in person, you're getting together, you're doing the session 0. This is the perfect time for everyone to go and watch that Rogue One trailer. And then you pull people aside one at a time. You just go, hey, come here. It lets everyone else decompress and talk about, oh, cool, I want to do this thing and Lovecraft with a shotgun. And, you know, they're all talking and you, hey, come here, just let's go over some quick stuff. Okay, awesome, great. Hey, thanks a lot. All right, Johnny, you're up. You know, and you kind of do that. I think it can really break the ice and let people converse.
If you separate conversations, the other thing that you can do that's really cool that I didn't include in session 0 is, hey, do you want there to be a secret about your character? Because if you've pulled them away from the table, this might be a good opportunity to fit that in, and you might be able to hide those secrets a little bit better. What was it? Will Wheaton show, Titan's Grave. He pulls the characters aside and does a secret with each one of them, and it really adds to the story. That game's a little more comic based, and so it's not everybody's cup of tea. But that's one of the things that I took from it that I saw as a good practice was to do player secrets and stuff like that.
That kind of segues into the next section, right? I mean, the nitty gritty, which is what we'll wrap up with this. You know, with no rush, but this is where we're going to really kind of land on. Everything else was very high concept and social agreements and contracts of what everyone's expectations are. How is the nitty gritty kind of pointed, and why is it different from the rest of this stuff? What are we doing now?
So, somebody brought up Microscope, and they said that they really like Microscope as a session 0, and that's kind of how session 0 should go, which is why Microscope actually works really well. You start very high, very wide, big concept, and you slowly bring it in and you dial it in. The reason that game is called Microscope is because that's how you use a microscope. You start on the biggest scale and you focus in as you go. And that's basically the idea. Once you get to the nitty gritty, essentially you're talking about things like at the beginning when you pitched, you said, hey, I want to use Dungeons and Dragons. Well, during this whole thing, we've discussed that maybe we want something a little bit more modern, and we still like the Eldritch Horror idea. Somebody might go, you know, I know we said Dungeons & Dragons, but what if we tried Savage Worlds instead? Or what if we tried Fantasy Flight Star Wars? Instead of doing it kind of modern, let's do it like a really kind of futuristic sci-fi type thing, and really kind of change the way that we were originally thinking. Again, this is an open conversation, so listen to the players, ask people's opinions, things like that. That's also where you're going to establish what books are involved, what kind of rules that you want to use, homebrew rules, any sort of optional rules. Like Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition has a lot of optional rules inside of it. Something that pretty much everybody does online, which is use feats, is technically an optional rule, and it's not part of the original game, but it adds a lot to it, which is why you see a lot of people do it. So those are things that I would make sure and discuss. From there, once you kind of have the basic idea, what you might want to do is check with them on their basic system knowledge. I'm a big fan of Legend of the Five Rings. I know that Tim's never played Legend of the Five Rings. He's probably seen the show once or twice and has a general idea of how it works, like there's skill rolls and there's attack rolls.
Even then, I don't know how skewed it would be, because the one I finished the entire thing of was your modern one.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that I'm getting the full flavor, because I know that most of that game, at least half of it, is the setting, right? Like that's the point, is the clans and all. So you reskinned it to be more like modern and Shadowrunny. So I'm even further off what you like. If that's my knowledge coming in, I might be way off, you know?
Yeah, the good part going into that example is if I was to teach you how to play L5R, I'd be like, okay, that I just changed the background. All the mechanics were the same. Basically, how it works is you get a pile of D10s. You form a pool using your aspect and your skill, and that tells you how many dice you roll, and then you keep your aspect. So, for example, if you have a 3 in fire and you have an agility check that you're going to make, which would be athletics, you roll 3 from fire plus 2 for your athletics, and you keep 3 because that's your attribute that goes into it. So you know how to roll inside there. Once you get the basic idea, if you get a 10 or a 0 on the die, that's what's called an explosion. You roll it again and you add it to the total. So your 10 could turn into a 28 or a 72 or something ridiculous. And basically it compounds. You keep 3 dice of your choice. So that doesn't mean you have to keep the best 3. You keep whatever 3 you choose. And the reason I emphasize that about L5R is because if you enter a duel and you don't want to kill your opponent, you're probably going to want to pick the lowest dice when you do damage.
So that kind of stuff is key. So so you're basically, if you're running L5R, you got to make sure I know sort of what I'm getting into so that my character concept can match the mechanics, is basically what it is.
And I start with mechanics first, like super basic mechanics. Like if I was to teach you Dungeons & Dragons, I would be like, okay, this is what a skill roll is. This is what an attack roll is. This is what your attributes mean. Those are the most basic elements of what it is to play D&D. After that, we make up a lot of stuff. So the other things we'll learn as we go. Like every level, you're going to get new abilities, and you can learn those abilities as you level up, and you'll become a pro at it in no time. But these are the things that you're going to need as soon as we start. Once you feel comfortable with that, we'll actually talk about how we're going to build your character, because now you understand what a strength score is, what a dexterity score is, what a constitution score is. From there, what I usually do is I go, this is kind of globally to all the players, hey, what's your concept? And for Legend of the Five Rings, this is where talking about the game comes back. Not only did you talk about the mechanical, Tim doesn't know much about the core system of Legend of the Five Rings. He knows that it's vaguely Japanese inspired, so he has a general idea that there's going to be samurai. There's obviously magic in it because he's seen pictures that come from L5R, and he knows that there's different clans. And I go, okay, well, that's pretty much what it is there's a lot of clan politics. There's 3 major classes. There's Bushi, which are warriors. There's courtiers, which are courtiers. And then there's Shugenja, which are your magic users. Shugenjas are a little different because they use elemental magic, but it comes from the kami, which are the gods. So it's like being a cleric who uses explosive elemental magic. And so now he has kind of an idea of what a Shugenja is, because that's the most complicated one of the 3. And then you can be like, well, Tim, now that you have a basic idea what it is, what strikes you? What do you think you'd want to play? Because Tim has an idea of what our campaign is going to be. Let's go back to that Dragon Grin reference. If Tim wasn't the one who made Dragon Grin, and let's say that Tim's just a regular guy I pulled to play this setting we found online, I could go, okay, Tim, I've kind of talked to you about it. Evil's taken over the world. This is a basic idea of these different classes. Luckily, they're all pretty easy to understand. A fighter is basically a fighter. The monk is a little bit more complicated. He's basically a mystical type fighter. He uses a little bit of mysticism and some self-centered type stuff to be able to do feats that are beyond normal, but not quite magic. Then you have a couple magic users, and probably the most complicated one of the magic users is the warlock. He basically is a normal person that has bound himself to a more powerful being to get something to be able to survive in the world. A great example of this would be Nate's character from that Dragon Grin campaign I showed you online. And then from there, I'd be like, okay, Tim, what stands out to you? What gets you really excited?
And then from there, I would probably say, well, I like the idea of someone who's, trying to stay out of the thick of all of this. So is there anybody who would be kind of on the fringes of society? Doesn't have to be necessarily a major spellcaster, but like someone who's kind of like Mad Max, or someone who's just kind of like roving the wilderness, just staying out of trouble and staying out of things.
Perfect. So you can, first off, the good thing about playing any role-playing game is you can kind of accomplish this with anything. The one that's going to do it the best is probably the ranger. The ranger is designed to be a nature guy. He lives out in the wilds, and he does things. Another alternative that you could do is the druid, which is a little bit more magic-focused than the ranger is. The ranger is like a fighter who uses magic to augment his abilities. The druid is more like a actual mage. In fact, and a lot of times they can actually be some of the most powerful mages inside a setting. But if you wanted to take it from kind of left field and say that you're a rogue who understands survival, here's a great way to do it. You could take the Outlander background and be a rogue, and maybe you focus in like trapping animals, and you're a fur trader by nature. And maybe that's where your ideas and your where you're learning on how to make traps and disable traps and things like that came from, was that experience.
That's great. And so, and this is going to be a diametrically opposite experience for someone who's like, that's why you ask them like, hey, what's your experience level with the mechanics? Because if they go, oh yeah, I play 5e, like, okay, great. You can skip all that.
Exactly.
But you need to be ready for that player that says, what now?
Yeah, and if you have one player that hasn't played, use this as an opportunity of being like, okay, now that you have a basic idea of what it is, how about we go to you last? We'll talk to these other guys, see what they have going on, and maybe what they say gives you an idea of what you could do. Here's the book. Take a look through it. Tell me if anything jumps out right now. If not, we'll go ahead and talk to the other guys.
That's perfect. And then, so after you have this concept, I guess one of the most important parts and really the final step for you as this game master is, where do they come from? Who are these people? Like, what's a little bit of their background, and how do they fit into Dragon Grin as a whole? I mean, that's kind of the final step, right?
And I did a video where I discussed in Dungeons and Dragons, and really any game, what the difference between a background and a backstory is. The basics of it is your background is a very mechanical thing. It's a thing that helps you out. It's how your skills are decided. In Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, it's literally its own mechanic. You attack it onto your character. It gives you a couple skills, a couple of tool proficiencies, some gear, and a special feature that you can do because you're an Outlander, or you're a farmer, or whatever the case may be. And then your backstory is actually who your character is. And even in games like Legend of the Five Rings that doesn't have a background mechanic inside there, what I do is I typically go, okay, who are you when you were learning to become a bushi? Because there's an important part of your life for about 13 years where you're a student. What skills did you learn? I know that you're a budding swordsman, but what did you do in your free time? Oh, you practiced origami? That should probably be one of your skills. This is where it is. And basically kind of show them that, like, L5R has very strange skills, as you can tell, because origami is legitimately one of the skills. And it's respected. It's an art. But that's something that you can build. Something that we used to do for any sort of Dungeons & Dragons game before backgrounds came along in like 3.5 is we picked our first level skills based upon who our characters were before they learned how to swing a sword. So like I had a character that was a cobbler. He had craft shoes as a skill. He had use rope because that would be something that he would actually do. It's around knot tying and things like that. He would have persuasion, profession, cobbler. Like literally all of my skills are only focused on who I was before I swung a sword, because all of my combat stuff in Dungeons and Dragons actually just comes from your class. There's no skill that goes into how you use a sword, but there is your base attack bonus in 3.5. That's what it was.
That's great. And so this is also where, and I was in a session 0 for the Provokers season 2. This is also where you can tie your characters together if you choose to do so. So it's up to you, and it's really just a preference. But if you don't want to have to meet and trust each other over time and over sessions, you can say, okay, what are some bonds we have? What are some things that we might have shared? And Matt did something cool. There's 4 of us. He basically said, hey, why don't we, and you can pick, 2 of you know each other and the other 2 of you kind of know each other. It doesn't have to be you know them personally, but somehow you're connected in some way. What are you thinking? And that really helped us start off with this good sense of character of where we all like kind of landed.
And I know you haven't gotten a chance to Dungeon World, but that's actually a rule that comes from Dungeon World, or the Apocalypse system, is the idea of bonds, that you, when you sit down, you pick 2 players to have some sort of relationship with your character.
Cool.
In Dungeon World, they have some pre-written ones, or you can write new ones. Like, let's say that Tim and I are playing in Lloyd's Viking game. One of the bonds that I had previously was that I left someone to die during a duel. And maybe Tim is the guy that I left in the snow to die. And now, for whatever reason, the fates have brought us together to accomplish something. But the fact that I left him to die in a duel out in the middle of nowhere, he's going to remember that. So am I. And that's going to shape our story.
That's great.
One of the things that I talked about inside there is your connections don't need to be concrete. A great example of this is in the show Leverage. Elliot, who is the hitter, the fighter type, he is a huge aficionado and actually very good at it, chef. He's very much into cooking. He's very detail orientated, which you see come up in everything he does. But one of the things that he absolutely loves is cooking. And his connection that eventually develops with the thief of the group is he teaches her how to love food, what food actually means, because she has this weird, the way she was brought up, she didn't really have a whole lot of like nurturing in her life. So she never really developed connections with people, and she's weird to begin with. But that one connection of her character will eventually love food forms a bond that can be played to the whole time. So like at the beginning of the story, Elliot's trying to explain to her what food means to him, why it saved his life and stopped him from being such a terrible person, that he learned that his knife could be used to create instead of destroy. And then as the story goes, she ends up loving food, and that becomes a common point between those 2 characters. And that's something you can play up. It doesn't have to be something that happens immediately, but it could be something you plan for.
Sure. That's great. And so this is the part where I think, encourage the group to get involved, encourage everyone to kind of talk to each other and come up with cool stuff, and just go with things unless they're absolutely out there, or unless they break any of the other social agreements you've made thus far.
Yeah.
Try to roll with people's ideas and suggestions, because, you want to be yes, and we can do this. But this is really a good place to say, this is why we do this last. Because we've already got a very solid framework that we've established the pitch. Here's the basic high concept. Okay, here are my expectations of what define that concept. Here's what I love and want to happen. Here's what I hate and don't want to happen. I want to kind of play this class. You have all the ingredients right there. Now it's just fine-tuning it with those bonds. It should sort of write itself.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing that I did stress inside this section is this is the most important part for you to write down things as a GM, because this is where your stories are going to come from, your most personal stories. You may have the overarching story of the corruptor is going to take over the land, but what's important is Durgan and his father have a strained relationship. That should come up inside the story at some point. That Brasswick is estranged from his church for some reason. that should come up at some point. And the other thing that I really like about doing a session 0 is Brasswick is estranged from his church that he needs to come to at some point. That may be a good time, which you can always address later, to say, hey, Brasswick, tell me a little bit more about your church. What was it like? What kind of practices did you do? Kind of get them brainstorming a little bit and give them a lot of power over the things that are in their background. What you want to do when it comes to a character's background is guide rather than tell. Just basically be like, okay, yeah, your church sounds really good. What if they had a ritual where once a year they brought forth a bunch of ale and they filled up a large vat in the center of the church and they baptized people in ale? Something ridiculous like that.
So
just to basically shape out and give a little bit more life to it. And this is a good way for you to basically interject things that you already planned as a DM to have later on. So, for example, the baptism by ale, perhaps maybe there is going to be a fight in a brewery, and that character, even though he doesn't know it, is eventually going to fall into a vat of ale and realize that perhaps maybe this isn't the best plan, is to have people swimming around in ale. And this is a really good time to find those things that you're going to call back on and bring up later on in the story. One of the things that I brought up in yesterday's live cast for a point of inspiration is that always touch back on the characters' backgrounds. And so that's why it's really important to make sure and take notes, because those things coming up later on will be a memorable scene. That character who falls in the vat of ale is going to remember it because you're going to have him bring up, what was your baptism like, and have them kind of flash back and think about that sort of thing.
I love that, because it also, for me, if you are paying attention as a game master, you can really pleasantly surprise your players that you were paying attention, that you do care about their story and what they're talking about. And this is the converse is true. If you don't write this stuff down and you have to ask them again, like, hey, what was that thing with the ale at your church again? Could you run me down on that? It's not as cool for a player to see it in the next session, because it's like, oh, okay, yeah. So
yeah, that's why I say that writing your notes down here is really key, because I find that if you don't touch it for a couple sessions at least, and then you bring it up, it's definitely more impressive. A great example of this was the Stratmere game. In Matt's character, he mentioned that his son was missing, but he never described how he was missing. So I pretty much took that ball and ran with it and gave him something that was a very hard choice for his character to make, that ultimately saved his son's life, even though he thought his son was dead. And that turned into a really good moment just by collaborating those two aspects of what he gave me and what my idea was, to go back into his story and kind of repress that issue forward.
I love that.
Go
ahead.
Yeah. The other thing that I did want to say is this is also where you talk about your concrete things. Of course, you're also going to mention, these are the available races. Here's the homebrew rules. Here's the optional rules. Here's the classes that are allowed. Or if it's a classless system, hey, you guys can do pretty much anything except for maybe this thing. One of the things that I used to do a lot of was a no magic campaign. And I didn't do it the way that some people do, which is to basically say, hey, if you have magic powers, describe them as mundane things. Because we were playing 3-5, I was like, no, you just can't have magic. If it casts, you can't be it, period. Because there was 100 classes to choose from that didn't have casting powers. It was possible.
Which makes sense. And I think this is all, like everything we've gone over, this is all really clearly laid out in this document, this checkbox. Like, Chris has done an awesome job of going through and making sure that you can jump through the entire thing piece by piece.
The one thing that I did want to add is, I forgot to mention it during the red light, green light, is I mentioned doing a scale of 1 to 10 or 0 to 10. How do you feel about this topic? If that doesn't feel good enough, think about touchstones like this for figuring out where people feel about this sort of thing. Tim told me he doesn't like very detailed, grotesque violence. I'm like, okay, how about this? Are you okay with HBO level violence? Or would you prefer something like what we would see on TNT or ABC? Like, what do you think would give me a good point of reference? And if he turns around and he tells me, well, there was this really good show that was on HBO that I thought did really well, because not HBO, Showtime. And what he's talking about is Penny Dreadful. Penny Dreadful does really good allusions to horror and violence without necessarily putting it in front of the camera. So knowing that, I can be like, okay, that gives me an idea of where I should make that fall. And ideally, if you're giving like channel names, the other players kind of have a vague idea. Think about doing references whenever people are having a hard time describing exactly what they're shooting for.
Sure. And even if, kind of like something you can try, if they're like, I don't know, I say, okay, well, what's the most violent movie you'll watch and enjoy?
Yeah.
It's like, well, it really depends on the context because I love Saving Private Ryan. So it's like, okay, because that beginning beach scene is super gory. Mm-hmm. So then it starts drilling down to where it's like, okay, you're not trying to talk them out of their opinion, but you're trying to quantify it and say, okay, so you're okay with war violence. You just don't like, I just don't like one-on-one. Like, I don't like serial killer violence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Like, all right. And then you kind of drill down and they're like, yeah, like I'll watch Braveheart and, all that stuff, but I just don't like, and it's like, okay, so on a grand scale, medieval violence or even war violence is okay. You just don't like person-to-person evil violence. And they're like, yeah, okay, no problem. And it still gives you that kind of baseline.
Perfect. For Power Up Games, we did put the link inside the chat. He was just asking to see the template, but I will.
Oh, sure, yeah, because that was a while back. If we could throw it in there, and I think
for it.
Beauty. I think we'll do like another few questions, and then we can call it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see if there's anything I missed on this list.
And thank you all for tuning in, for jumping in here and hanging out with us today. This was pretty last minute. We've tried to schedule this a few times, and it was my fault every time that we didn't follow through. But there was no notice, no event. I was just like, hey, let's throw up and let's see who shows up. And a ton of people showed up, and you're all amazing. So did you miss anything, Chris?
I did miss one thing, and this is super important for your players, not necessarily for you. Discuss how advancement is going to work in your game. Because if you don't plan to advance them ever, and it's going to be one story in Stone Rift, and it's going to take 6 sessions to do, your players need to understand that they're not going to level up in 6 sessions, which is a very long time for a player to be like sitting on his hands hoping for the next ability. Because the difference between levels 4 and 5 is an extra attack, and that's huge. And maybe you don't want to make that jump, but your players need to be made aware that you don't want to make that jump.
Especially because in these sorts of games and in RPGs, the reward mechanics are very important, I think, to keep people feeling as though they're progressing, even if the story isn't moving at the pace they want. They have these big character arcs, or like the baptism we talked about a moment ago, or there are these big things. Those take long to pay off. So it's like a slow growing garden. So other things like leveling up and getting a cool ability, or getting some equipment, or some new, like a new wagon, all these things seem small, but it gives the sense of advancement so that the players feel as though they're making progress. World of Warcraft did this perfectly to an addictive point.
World of Warcraft, if you can find any documentaries on how they actually did their award systems, it's really good for just game design practice, because a lot of it is focused on what is important to that character. An example from the Dragonborn campaign from the Tabletop Terrors channel is they fight this evil character at the beginning, and when they take him out, they receive a dagger and a wagon. Those are super important items for them to get to survive the problems that they have coming up. That is an advancement. If they didn't have that, the game would be very different. So not only think about it in physical advancement of the character, but think about it in terms of like items, or whether they're mundane or magical. A big thing that I'm a fan of, thanks to L5R, is favors. I love giving players favors because I don't think magic items should exist in super abundance. Instead, you save the king's daughter, the king owes you one, and he's going to pay good on that. He might not pay exactly the way you want, but he's going to help you out later on because you helped him out.
That's a really good one. I actually just did a video about interesting treasure ideas, and one of them is deeds or property. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be a mansion. I'm not suggesting you give your players a fort right up front. Even if it's something as small as this dirty little hovel that's 2 rooms, and has taxes owed on it. It's plot hooks and all kinds of stuff, but giving them these little rewards that make them feel tied to the world. It's like, hey, I don't own much land, but I own 100 feet in either direction and a shack.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in my current L5R campaign, they're actually in a whole different region of the world. They don't own land right now. So that's going to be one of the things that I'm going to look at as a GM to award them with, because they're going to run out of money if they keep staying in hotels, especially if they keep staying in good hotels.
I love that. And that's a whole nother stream, which is that's when resource management matters. You know, not just what inn are we going to pretend to stay at? It's like, hey, we don't have money. Where are we going to sleep?
Yeah, exactly.
Any other good question? Oh, go ahead.
Bring up in the nitty gritty is resource management. How much focus do you want to have resources? Do you want to be like, okay, you're an archer, you obviously have arrows. We're going to say that you're like halfway out of your arrows when it's thematically important, and then we're going to say you're out of arrows when it's thematically important. But we're never going to really track those arrows. That you're pretty much like Legolas. You're going to have arrows when you need them, unless it makes sense for the story for you not to have them at the moment and it be an intense scene. Or are you going to be like, okay, you can logically only hold 4 quivers on your body with 20 arrows apiece. I need you to track them. You're going into a dungeon. You have 6 days worth of food in your bag. You figure that this is going to be a 2-month journey. You can't get a cart down there. How are you getting all your food in there? Do you have enough rope? Do you have sleeping bags for everyone? Do you have extra blankets because you're going to be underground and it's going to be extra cold? Like, how much tracking on resource management do you really want to do?
Right. Just deciding that up front. And this is the thing I'll say. We'll take like 1 or 2 more questions, but I want to make this very, very clear. If you've gotten this far and this seems like a lot and you think, what am I going to do? And you've got this checklist and you're printing it out. At any point in time, you can also, if you absolutely need to, make the social contract. Hey guys, we don't know the answer to this question. We will agree as we play. Now that's not ideal, but I don't want this to stop you from playing. This is supposed to be a tool to allow you to continue in a way that makes it the least amount of conflict and the most amount of fun. So if you get to this list and you're like, I just don't know, just go for it with the best understanding you have, and then feel free to check those boxes as you come up on those circumstances.
Perfect. So Super Snake Gaming asked how long a session 0 should be. This is kind of going back to a stream that Tim did earlier this week. As long as it needs to be, is kind of the best answer. Typically, if it's a group that I have gamed with, or I'm confident because they're experienced players and I've seen them around, maybe an hour. With less experienced players or players that are new to a system, it could be longer. Like if I was to take Tim and a couple other people from the community and teach them how to play Legend of the Five Rings, I expect that teaching them the basics of the system is probably going to eat 30 minutes. So I'm looking at least an hour and a half. Telling them about the lore will probably take about an hour, or maybe a little less, depending on what I want to focus on. If you have a setting that's full of like just tons and tons of lore, what I like to do is I tell them, hey, these are the important parts. Absolute Tabletop's books are really good about that, because inside the timeline, Matt Click, who's apparently the master of timelines, gives you 2 sentences and says, hey, this is what this is about. This is the kind of stuff that's happening. From the Stone Rift book, there's a point inside there that's like 1200 is the year. He talks about the deep slum sickness and that there were nobles that were behind it. And I was like, hey, what if we played that? So I've got a game coming up that is a trilogy to discover who those nobles are and who the heroes were that actually brought those nobles justice. So think about it like that. Think about if you've got an idea of a year, go maybe like 10 years back or 20 years back and maybe give them an idea of that. You don't need to worry about what's in the future unless you really want to stick heavy to the canon. Star Wars is one of those tricky ones. There are some people that really, really, really want everything that happened in Star Wars to happen. I find that very restrictive. So for me, I like saying that everything that is up to this year for, like, let's say the Battle of Yavin, everything that happens before the Battle of Yavin, I said Yavin the first time, Yavin, is true. But everything after the Battle of Yavin is our story. Things will happen. Those characters exist. Everything that they did existed, but they're going to be seen differently than we see them in the movies and the books, because this is your story. And I'm very focused as a GM on your story is more important than what the world is doing. So for me, that's the style that works. Though I do know other GMs that are like, nope, the old republic's about to fall. Palpatine's going to rise to power, and you guys really won't be able to stop that. It's just beyond your scope. And that's a totally awesome and good answer, because chances are my little level 6 character is not going to take down the Emperor. Let's just be honest. Unless I set up some like huge crazy trap and manage to hide it from like one of the most powerful Force beings, it's probably not going to happen.
Right. And that's, to me, I think too, that's why these social contracts are so important, because if you got one player who's like, no, Star Wars is canon and everything that happened needs to happen, and you've got the other player who's like, no, but I want to tell my story. I think it's really important that you come up with some sort of a balance in the moment and say, okay, for our game, let's pick a few things that will definitely happen. And then so that way everyone gets their way. If you didn't do that, you're talking about a knockdown, drag out fight in the middle of your Star Wars campaign that you could have totally avoided. That's going to sneak up on you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Super Snake Gaming also asked, do you as a GM plan the end of a campaign? I personally do, but in very broad strokes. I think of things like, okay, let's go with my Legends of the Five Rings, the season that's on YouTube right now, because that one's very old, and hopefully I don't spoil anything for everybody. My idea is that I want things to come to a head, that the players are forced to leave Rukagon and go to the colonies, that in order to stop the biggest evil in the world, which they're not powerful enough to do, they have to leave everything behind and try to find a way to stop it. The end of season 1 has a lot of accomplishments that go with it, but it's also got this turn on it where it's like, we're not ready for this. I don't know that we're going to be ready for this. And that's going into season 2 after that. Which that campaign, I wanted to end on that note of, yeah, we saved the land today, but the land is not really safe. That threat is still out there. Is it something we can compete with? So I think about that ahead of time, and I make adjustments as the campaign goes. Probably the most solid kind of example of this coming from Matt Click's channel is the Provokers. The Corruptor was intended to be a bad guy that you would see in the second game and you guys would defeat. Because the players latched onto him, really liked him as a bad guy, he became, okay, maybe we should put him out to like the third or fifth episode. And then it was like, oh no, the Corruptor's building, he's becoming something more. You know what, maybe the Corruptor needs to be our final boss, or at least one of the bosses up to the final. And then towards the end, you find out that the Corruptor is just a minion of someone else. And there's this huge question of who this someone else is, because this someone else is something that just completely came out of almost nowhere. And that's an acceptable answer, adjusting on the fly.
And I think, too, that one of the things that really helped me figure this out, and I just did a stream, because this is Matt Click's advice, is you place these pieces on the board. So to me, do you plan the end of a campaign? You should have in your mind, after, I'll say this, run a few games first in my world. I run a few games first to kind of see what's important and what pieces the players interact with, and then go, okay, I kind of see where this arc can go. And then from there, what I do is decide what is going to try to happen. And then the players get to try to stop it or not. So if I have someone who's like, no, they're coming into this region, they're taking over, and they're going to kidnap every child 11 and under, the story ends when that either happens and the heroes failed, or that doesn't happen and they succeeded. But that's kind of where I'm thinking, okay, this is the big event that make the world happen around the players. Have these things kind of going on, because then you're not trying to write an ending to a story. It's like, no, look, this is real life. This is happening. Okay, did you stop it? Oh, great. Even if they stop it 5 sessions early, then what? Or is this campaign over? You know?
Absolutely. And that's why I say I'm a very player story focused GM, because I think that provides the most enjoyable experience, at least for the way that I GM. And some GMs, they are more focused on how the world works. For me, I'll have things going on in the background, but they may or may not necessarily affect everything that your character does. In Murdoch's games, which is one of my normal players, his world is alive, and it doesn't matter what you do as a PC, things will happen. And if another country passes a law that outlaws magic users, you cross over the border, you may find yourself in prison, and there's nothing you could have done to stop it, which I think is a very interesting way to do it. So definitely a good way to look at it is figure out how you want to tell your story, from a world scale or a personal scale. I personally like the personal scale, but that's just my flavor of choice. And it looks like we've got some questions that you pulled, Tim. You want to go ahead and ask those?
Sure. So, well, there's two, and I think we'll probably end with these two, because there's one that's, I think, a lot of people could benefit from, and then the next one is probably the best way to bookend this entire stream. So one of them is from Corbett Myers, and he says, are there any good suggestions for first game materials, books, gear, etc.? What I'll say is, to me, nothing beats free. And I would suggest getting, if you just Google D&D 5th edition basic rules, and you can just download the basic rules for Dungeons and Dragons for free. Chris, do you know of any good online dice rollers that you can use off of, like, outside of Google Hangouts?
Yeah, Roll20 is what I usually use, actually, for Legend of the Five Rings, because you can eventually get to a pool where you're rolling 10 dice, keeping 14 dice, which does this weird math to turn into 10 dice rolled, 10 dice kept, plus some bonuses. So what I did is I wrote out how the dice should be rolled inside the macro system, and now my players, when they need to roll a skill, they click a button, and they can put in their numbers, and it does it for them. It helps us tell the story faster, because the more dice you add to a story, the more drug-on turns get. Even when I play 5th edition, if I play past level 10, usually, I will open up one of my own Roll20 tabs on my computer, even if the game's not in Roll20, punch in all of my rolls, and just click the button every time it's my turn, just to make things go a little bit more fluidly.
That's really smart. And so do I just need a Roll20 account that's free? I log in, I sign up?
It's a free account. You basically go to the website, you sign up, register for it just like you normally do, accept the email, say that you are a human, and then basically you're in. From there, they've got message boards where they actually look for people to run games and play games with as well, which you may have some luck with. I know some people in our community have. I personally haven't, so I like doing the Facebook groups a little better.
Sure.
That would be one of the things that I would add to the list, is find yourself a couple Facebook groups, especially if you've never played before, because chances are you're going to have questions. And if you get yourself in a good group like the Absolute Tabletop group, and you ask those questions as inexperienced or greenhorn or whatever you want to call them, the type of questions you have, if you're in a good group, they're going to positively come back to you, and they're going to say, hey, man, so this is what an attack roll is. Which sounds like the most basic thing inside the game, but if you don't know it and you don't necessarily feel comfortable asking the people you're with, or maybe you haven't found a group yet and you still just don't understand how this one basic rule is, just ask. A great system is the Apocalypse engine, or the World engine, I should say, which is basically Dungeon World, Apocalypse World, or anything that ends in world. The confusing part is the way that the language is written in Apocalypse World is very thematic to the setting. So it sounds like some apocalypse doom drifter is telling you about this game throughout the whole thing, and it's narrated like from an RP's perspective to you about the rules, which sounds really fun, except for the fact that the narrator like curses and he uses incomplete sentences and improper grammar, and you're trying to figure out like how to roll a way, like how you threaten somebody. And there's two rules that, because of the verbiage, sound like they could both be used to threaten someone. So go to an Apocalypse World forum and be like, hey, I have no idea how going aggro works. Can somebody tell me how that works? Is that actually threatening somebody, or is that actually attacking somebody? And don't feel weird about that. I mean, that's totally cool to ask that question. The big things that I would suggest is making sure that you have what is appropriate for that game. If you have a question about what is appropriate for that game, this is where those Facebook groups and stuff like that come in. Be like, hey, I'm a brand new person to Legend of the Five Rings. What should I pick up? My advice is pick up a tube of 10 D10, because that's all the dice that you're going to need. Pick up the core rule book on Drive-Thru RPG, because it's cheap, or you pick up the starter box. I would go with the core rule book because you're going to get more mileage out of it. And then you can go to drive through and they have a Gen Con adventure that they passed out for free. And I think it's like $1 or it's free, something like that. You could download that. And because it's a introductory adventure, they basically outline how to do all the steps in it. If you play that with a group, you'll all learn at the same time and be able to help each other with the process of learning the game. Easy enough. The other thing that I would consider is how you want to play the game. So if you are using Roll20, Roll20 happens to have a grid inside there. If you want to use that aspect, think about how you're going to do tokens. If you're going to use maps, things like that. Personally, I use my Roll20 as a storage for my campaign. For Legend of the Five Rings, I have notes about each of the clans. I have major NPCs in the handouts. I have maps of the world, but not necessarily maps of cities or battle maps or anything like that. So if my players are in the colonies, I move them over to the colony map. If they're in Rukagon, I move them over to Rukagon. That sort of thing. Lastly, I would look at if your game requires anything extra. The reason I would look at this one is because Savage Worlds is probably the best example of it. Savage Worlds uses a deck of cards for initiative. It uses dice for actual game mechanics. And then it uses poker chips for a hero point type system. All of those things make for a very interesting game, but you have to plan on how you're going to do that. If you're going to do it in person, if you're going to do it online, if you do it online, if you use Roll20, it's got a deck of cards in there, but it doesn't have poker chips, so you have to add those. You have to figure out a good way to do your poker chips if you want to have them on the map, or if you want to make a deck of cards that looks like poker chips, or whatever the case is. And that's where, again, those forums and Facebook groups really help out, because somebody in there's gone through the painstaking process to create that before you. So just ask them and they'll tell you the best way. That way you don't have to spend 8 hours and find out you could have done it easier if you did it a different way.
Yeah, and so I think that, to me, that's, I mean, you just covered it. Like, that whole section we could cut and make its own video on how, like, what you need. I will say this too, at the most basic level for D&D 5e, you get those basic rules, dice, and a dungeon master.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's just like, just starting out.
My beginner kit, if I was to like box it up and gift it to somebody for Christmas or something, I would probably do like the basic rules, a set of the Chessex like multi-shaped dice, all those D20s and D8s and all that stuff. Maybe a box of additional D6s, because D6s get used a lot. Yeah, exactly, one of those. And then maybe a character sheet, because, you know, it'd be nice because it's a gift box for somebody. But that's basically all you really need.
That's it.
A lot of these games, their core rulebook usually gives you enough to be able to actually run the game. Like, they may sell a Dungeon Master's Guide, or they may sell some sort of what is it? Lore Keeper's Guide is what the One Ring uses.
Yeah.
L5R has tons of books. Every book has lore in it, so every book is worthwhile for the GM to own eventually, but they're not necessary. The core book in most cases is enough to get you by for a long time. I mean, when we played 3.5 and AD&D, we had a lot of AD&D, so we kind of knew what we were doing going into 3.5, but like, I remember we didn't even have the player's handbook. We started with a monster manual and didn't know that there was a player's handbook, because we didn't really read it. And we're like, yeah, let's be like dragon fighting knights. All right, cool. And we played like that for like a month. And then we're like, oh, there's other books. Okay, cool. So these numbers mean stuff. And we ended up picking up the player's handbook, and we still did not follow the rules until probably about 3 years of playing did we figure out there are actually rules to it.
That's the point. It's like, that's the thing. If I have to give people basic advice, it's that all of this stuff we've talked about, just wing it and do it your own way. This is just a guideline so that you're like, oh, this is how these dudes do it. All right, I'm going to do it this way. These guys played D&D for years without rules. Was it, Chris, was it any less fun?
Oh, no, we had tons of fun with it. It was weird because, like, we had one GM that would occasionally come by, and he'd try and teach us the rules while we were there. So we would learn some of the rules somewhat, because he played like one game with us, and then he left.
Just enough to be dangerous?
Yeah, exactly. And it wasn't really until 3.5 where we're like, okay, we actually have to read and figure out what this game's about. We've been playing it for a while. We got to figure this thing out.
I love that. So I'm gonna end it. We're gonna end with one final question, which I think is a fantastic question, and this is from another one from Super Snake Gaming.
Okay.
What do you usually do if the players are getting bored? And so I want to say two things. It's phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is I would ask you, did you do any of this stuff? Because this is the boredom repellent.
Mm-hmm.
Finding out a laundry list of what your players like, what they want to do, how they want to do it, what they don't want to do, all this stuff up front, and working with them, building bonds with the characters, that's boredom repellent because you have a little, like Chris said, the gift box. It's a DM's gift box of all the cool stuff they want to do. So that's phase 1 is do this to make sure that everybody's on the same page, and then boredom will be less frequent. Step 2 is if you've taken your notes well, doing this session, or if you record the session, if things start to get stagnant, if you want to try to do it as a DM on the back end and kind of go, okay, well, let me look through my notes. Am I doing something wrong? You can rewatch or re-listen. But the easiest thing is if a player seems bored, do what Chris mentioned. The next day, just reach out. Hey, Chris, what's up, man? Listen, I might be reading into it, but you seem like you were a little bored last session. Is there anything that I can do? You know, first of all, am I correct? And then second of all, is there anything I can do to kind of make sure that the game's more fun for you? So that would be my advice is use session 0 constantly and then just ask them straight out.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite things to do for a session 0, and I probably should have started with this, was I buy a notebook that is for the campaign. And on my first 2 pages, usually, is actually my session 0 stuff. And I never take it out of that notebook. It always stays right up front so that if I ever need to reference it, it's right there. The easiest way to bring a player back that's bored is to bring up their background. If you did not run a session 0 and you're playing, let's say, a pickup game online that turned into a campaign, best example of this is, of course, the Provokers. It was a pickup game that eventually evolved into a campaign and actually had a full story with it. One of the good things that you could do is go, okay, well, we didn't really talk about it. Dice's background as a soldier. Dice seems like he's been getting a little bored for the last 2 games. What if we bring in a person who served with Dice, or maybe another soldier, and there's like a commonality, like a mirror of his own character that he can interact with, and that almost instantly will snag somebody in. Finding a way to bring their character into the story, or at least bring them deeper into the story, is a really great way to do it. Like the best example is as Dice transitioned from just being a common foot soldier to more of a mage, he fought another caster and lost his staff during the fight, and he ends up picking up her staff after she falls. Well, now he has this constant reminder that he brings with him of what it means to actually be a caster. And that's a good turning point for his character, but it's also a good way to bring him back into the game and make him more focused.
Well, hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully it's been useful. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed to Chris's channel, it's called Drop Dice. Go check him out. Subscribe. Really good channel. Lots of really good content. Check out A Point of Inspiration. It's his indie publishing company. And Chris, is there anything particular you want people to check out, or that you want to tell the audience about?
One of the things that I would recommend is if you do check out A Point of Inspiration, we've been doing kind of weekly drops of our own version of Unearthed Arcana, talking about the 3 settings that we have kind of building right now. Mine happens to be Strapmere, and there's some games that are featured in it. But inside there, we talk about at least 2 of the worlds with each one. And we are always looking for feedback. They are set up to be Google Documents with comment sections. So if you see something and you're like, oh man, that's really powerful, you guys should dial it back, let us know. Because I mean, we cannot test things in a soundproof box and find any real successful results. The one thing that I was going to say is there's, I mentioned at the beginning about how people direct a show or a movie or even design a video game. The one thing that is different about doing a role-playing game is how you can target your audience. So the session 0, the best part about it is it gives you very direct information about the people who are actually going to play your game. Whereas if I was developing the next Assassin's Creed, I have to think about things that I assume that the player audience really enjoys. And if I judge it incorrectly, I could end up with Assassin's Creed Unity, which nobody really wants to play. So you have a really strong tool at your disposal. So don't think that it ends with that session 0 either. Like Tim said, you can always bring this stuff back up.
Well, guys, check out Drop Dice. If you have stuck with us till this part in the video, thank you for watching. Hopefully you get some mileage out of this stuff. I will link the Google Doc immediately in the group. No, in the video description. And then what I'll do is I'm going to put the article, we'll make it an actual full-blown article, and I'll put it into blog format on tabletopterrors.com, and you can check out that checklist and all that good stuff.
Yeah, and I see that there are some people that corrected my my grammar and stuff like that. I typed it up literally just before we started this thing, so I appreciate all the help that people have given me.
That's perfect, man. Crowdsource. So anyway, this has been amazing. Thank you all, and hopefully this works for you. But more importantly, describe down below, how does this work for you? What did we miss? What do you like? What don't you like? We want to hear how this session 0 works for you. Thank you, guys, and until next time, may your dice roll high.